the Galactic Council never expected Earth to strike back. The air recycler on Deck 9 had been broken for 6 days. I know because I counted every hour I spent breathing stale, warm air while shoveling iron ore from one container to another. My hands were raw. My back felt like someone had driven a metal rod through it and left it there. The crate I was filling weighed 400 kilograms when full, and I had filled 11 of them since my shift started. 11 crates. No water break. No word from the overseers except the occasional low click of disapproval when I slowed down. My name is Dara Moss. I am 31 years old. I was born in Bristol, on a planet called Earth, which the Galactic Council refers to in its official documents as Vassal World 7. I have not been home in 8 years. I do not know if home still looks the same. I do not let myself think about it much, because thinking about it makes my hands shake, and shaking hands drop things, and dropping things gets you noticed. Being noticed on this ship is the last thing you want. The freighter was called something in the Council's language that I could not pronounce. We humans called it the box, because that is exactly what it felt like. A long, gray, lightless box drifting through space, full of ore and people who were not considered much different from the ore. The Council species who ran the ship were called the Vorath. They were tall, pale, and had 4 arms, 2 of which ended in flat, wide hands built for operating controls, and 2 of which ended in something closer to claws. They communicated mostly in clicks and low tones. They found human speech irritating. They found most things about humans irritating. 40 years ago, when the Council ships first appeared in Earth's orbit, humanity had tried everything. Diplomacy, appeals to reason, offers of resources, technology, cultural exchange. The Council had listened patiently, the way you might listen to a child trying to explain why they should be allowed to stay up past bedtime, and then they had informed Earth's governments, in careful and translated language, that humanity had been assessed as pre-rational, emotionally unstable. A developing species, not yet ready for membership in the civilized galaxy. And then they had begun the collection. That was what they called it, not occupation, not conquest, the collection, as if we were interesting rocks they had decided to keep. I shoved another load of ore into the crate and felt the familiar burn spread across my shoulders. Beside me, a man named Colin worked in silence. Colin was from Glasgow. He was 44, broad-shouldered, and had a way of moving that suggested he had once been strong in a different way, before the box had slowly worn him down. We did not talk much during shifts. Talking was not prohibited exactly, but it attracted attention, and attention was dangerous. 3 crates down, a woman named Petra was working. Petra was from Warsaw. She spoke 4 languages and had been, before the collection, a structural engineer. Now she sorted ore. She sorted it very well and very fast, because Petra was the kind of person who brought total focus to whatever she was doing, even when what she was doing was beneath her in every possible way. I liked Petra. I liked Colin. On a ship where the only humans were laborers and the only aliens were overseers, you learned to value the people around you quickly and quietly. The overseer that shift was named something we could not say, so we called him Gray, because of the particular shade of his skin. Gray moved up and down the cargo bay with his hands clasped behind 2 of his 4 arms, watching us the way a man watches insects crossing a footpath. Not with anger, not even with contempt, with the mild, detached attention of someone who does not particularly care what the insects are doing but checks on them out of habit. I had learned over 2 years on the box that Gray's mood shifted when the ore tonnage numbers fell below target. His movements became sharper. The clicking of his communication became clipped and fast. And then things happened that were filed in the official records of the Galactic Council Freighter Service as equipment malfunctions. I had seen 3 equipment malfunctions in 2 years. The first was a man named Oliver from Cape Town who had sprained his wrist and could not keep pace for 4 days. The second was a woman named Helen from Auckland who had refused an order she had not understood because the translation device on her collar was broken. The third had happened 10 days ago, and I was still trying not to think about it. His name was Rob. He was 26. He had been slowing down for a week because he was sick, properly sick, running a fever that no one had treated because the medical officer on the ship did not consider human illness worth his attention unless the human in question could no longer stand. Rob had been standing. Barely, but standing. On the 7th day of his fever, he had dropped a crate. Gray had walked over to him without hurrying. I had kept my eyes on my own work, because I had learned that looking directly at these moments made them worse. I heard the low, resonant sound that Gray made when he was issuing a final assessment. I heard Rob try to say something, and then I heard nothing at all. The official report said equipment malfunction, partial structural failure leading to loss of function. The crate was replaced. Rob was not. I thought about Rob while I shoveled. I thought about him the way you think about something that has lodged itself in your chest and will not come loose. I thought about the 26 years he had lived, and the fact that they were over, and the fact that nobody outside this ship would ever know his name, because the council did not keep records of individual human laborers. We were listed by number, not by name. I was H7441. Colin was H7437. Petra was H7452. Rob had been H7449. I found the chip at midday. Midday on the box was not really midday. There was no day. There was only the shift cycle, and when the shift cycle reached its midpoint, we were given 12 minutes to eat. The food came in sealed gray blocks that tasted like nothing in particular. I had stopped tasting it about a year in. I just chewed and swallowed. The chip was inside my ration block. I almost choked on it. It was small, flat, no larger than my thumbnail, and it had been pressed into the center of the block with enough pressure to keep it hidden but not enough to damage it. I looked up immediately, checking for Gray. He was at the far end of the bay, his back to us. I closed my hand around the chip and kept eating. My heart was doing something I had not felt it do in a long time. It was moving fast, not from fear exactly, or not only from fear. I did not know what was on the chip. I did not have a reader, but I knew with a certainty I could not explain that it had not fallen into my food by accident. Someone had put it there. Someone who knew my number. Someone who knew my block. After the break back at the crates, I passed close to Colin on my way to the loader. I did not look at him. I pressed the chip into his palm as our hands crossed in the space between us. He closed his fingers around it without a word, without a flinch, without a single change in his expression. I had chosen Colin because Colin was the one of us who had, quietly and without ever explaining how, gotten hold of a small handheld reader 3 months ago. He kept it inside a hollow in the sole of his left boot. 4 hours later, at the end of the shift, Colin walked past my bunk in the sleeping corridor. He did not stop. He did not speak. But he pressed a folded scrap of material into my hand, the kind we used to wrap blisters, and when I unfolded it in the dark of my bunk with the blanket pulled over my head, I found 3 words scratched into the surface in small, careful letters. The date is set. I lay very still for a long time. 3 words, that was all. But I had heard enough whispers over 2 years, enough fragments of coded conversation, enough carefully worded silences to understand what those 3 words meant. The resistance. The network that was supposed to be theoretical, that Gray and the other overseers dismissed the way you dismiss a rumor you find too absurd to investigate. The thing that humans told each other about in the dark, quietly, not always believing it themselves. It was real. I turned onto my back and stared at the ceiling of the sleeping corridor. The lights were off. The recycler hummed. Somewhere down the row, someone was coughing softly. I thought about Rob again. I thought about Oliver and Helen. I thought about every number that had replaced a name on the crew manifest. I thought about Bristol, and the particular color of the sky there in the early morning. A pale gray-blue that I had never seen anywhere else in the galaxy, because nowhere else in the galaxy was home. I did not sleep. But for the first time in 2 years, lying in the dark on a ship that was not mine, breathing air that was not clean, with sore hands and a number instead of a name, I felt something stir in my chest that I had stopped expecting to feel. It was not hope exactly. Hope felt too light a word for what it was. It was heavier than hope. It was older. It was the feeling of a door you had believed was sealed forever developing, in the dark, in secret, the faintest possible crack of light around its edges. I pressed the scrap of material flat against my palm and held it there until morning. Part 2. Colin told me on a Tuesday, or what we called Tuesday, which was simply the name we had given to the second day of our 7-day shift cycle. Because without names for things you lose your grip on time, and losing your grip on time on a ship like the box was a fast way to lose your grip on everything else. So we had names for the days, and we kept track of them the way people keep track of small, important things when everything else has been taken from them. Tuesday, midway through the oar shift, Gray was conducting one of his slow, indifferent rounds of the bay, clicking to himself about tonnage figures. I was at the loader. Colin drifted past me on his way to get an empty crate, and without breaking stride, without looking at me, he said very quietly, "Tonight, bunk 12. That was all. I spent the rest of the shift not thinking about it, which was the only way I knew how to survive things I could not act on immediately. I focused on the oar, on the weight of the shovel, on the sound of the loader mechanism, on the rhythm of the work, which after 2 years had become automatic enough that my hands knew what to do without my mind having to direct them, which meant my mind was free to do other things, which was usually a problem and tonight felt like a gift. Petra glanced at me once around the 8th hour, just a glance, but I had known Petra for long enough to read what was in it. She knew she was coming too. Bunk 12 belonged to a man named Gareth. Gareth was from Cardiff. He was 53 years old, thin in the way that men get thin when they have been doing hard labor for years, and the food has never quite been enough, with gray in his hair and steady hands and eyes that saw everything without seeming to look at anything. Gareth had been on the box longer than any of us. 6 years. Nobody stayed on the box for 6 years without a reason, and Gareth's reason, I was about to learn, was not the reason I had assumed. I had assumed he had simply run out of options. I was wrong. There were 5 of us in bunk 12 that night. Me, Colin, Petra, Gareth, and a young woman named Lucy who worked on the upper cargo deck, and whom I had only spoken to a handful of times. Lucy was 23 from Edinburgh and moved through the ship like someone who had learned to be invisible, which I now understood had been deliberate. Gareth spoke in a voice just above a whisper, and we all leaned in close, because the walls of the sleeping corridor were thin, and the council had audio sensors positioned every 30 meters. The sensors were calibrated to detect elevated vocal frequencies, which was why we all kept our voices low and even. Another thing the council did not know about humans: we can have entire conversations at a volume that does not trigger their detection threshold. We had figured that out in the first year, and told each other about it without ever putting it in writing. Gareth said the chip was from Yusuf. I knew the name. I had heard it twice in the last year, both times in the same careful, guarded way that people say the names of things they are not sure they should believe in. Yusuf Akafar, a name that moved through the human labor networks like a current under still water. An engineer, supposedly. Someone who had been on 15 different council ships in 8 years, never staying long enough to become a fixture, always moving on before the overseers could build a clear picture of him. A ghost, some people said. A story other people had invented to keep themselves going. He is real, Gareth said, and looked at me specifically when he said it, as if he had heard my doubt before I expressed it. I have met him, twice. He has been building this for 4 years. Petra asked what this was. Gareth told us. I sat in the dark of bunk 12 and listened to the shape of it unfold, and the longer I listened, the more something cold moved through me. Not fear. Something more complex than fear. It was the feeling of a thing you had believed was impossible slowly revealing itself to be not only possible but already in motion. 34 worlds. That was the number. 34 council-controlled planets and stations and freighters where human workers had been quietly, carefully over years, doing exactly what we had been doing tonight: learning, mapping, Memorizing. The council had a saying, Gareth told us. He had learned it from a translation document that a council administrator had carelessly left open on a shared terminal 3 years ago. The saying translated roughly as, "The useful creature does not plan." It was a proverb they applied specifically to species they had classified as pre-rational. It was their way of saying that the beings they used for labor were incapable of sustained strategic thought. They believed that with complete confidence. They had believed it for 40 years while we planned. Lucy leaned forward and said, "Why Dara, the chip I mean, why was it in her ration block?" Gareth looked at me. "Your monitoring file," he said. "The council keeps emotional stability readings on all human workers. It is one of their standard metrics. They use it to predict behavioral risk." I knew this. The collar we all wore was not just a translation device. It had biometric sensors. The overseers received daily reports on our stress levels, our sleep patterns, our emotional state. "Your readings," Gareth said, "have been reading as advanced resignation for 14 months, which in their classification system places you in the lowest possible behavioral risk category." I stared at him. "You look to their sensors like someone who has given up completely," he said. "You are not flagged. You are not monitored closely. You are, as far as their system is concerned, a functioning unit with no risk of disruption." "But I have not given up," I said. "No," Gareth said, "you have not, but you are very good at looking like you have. That is not a small thing, Dara. That is exactly the kind of person this needs." I thought about what that meant. I thought about 14 months of getting up every shift and doing the work and keeping my face still and my voice level and my hands steady, not because I had accepted what was happening, but because showing that I had not accepted it felt dangerous. 14 months of survival behavior that had, without my knowing it, made me look like the perfect asset to a resistance network. The council had designed their monitoring system to identify humans who might cause problems. It had never occurred to them to consider that the humans who looked most compliant might simply be the ones who had learned to hide better. That was the moment I understood, fully and for the first time, what Yusuf Akafar had understood years before me. The Council's greatest weapon against us was also their greatest blind spot. They were so certain of what we were that they could not see what we were becoming. Gareth laid out what was needed from our cell specifically. The box carried two things of strategic value: its ore, which was irrelevant, and its navigation core, which was not. The navigation core held encrypted routing data for 17 council supply lines in this sector. If that data could be copied and transmitted to the resistance network before 0 hour, it would give the uprising forces the ability to cut council resupply to 14 stations simultaneously, within the first 48 hours of the strike. The core was in the ship's operations deck. The operations deck required a Level 4 access code to enter. We did not have a Level 4 code. We had something better. Petra said before Gareth could explain, the tertiary maintenance hatch, behind the water reclamation unit on Deck 6. She said it the way she said everything, quietly and precisely, like someone reading from a document she had already memorized. It bypasses the access code requirement because it was built as an emergency engineering route. The council specifications classify it as a non-secure access point because no one below officer rank is supposed to know it exists. She paused. "I found it 14 months ago," she said. "I have been waiting." We all looked at her. "I did not know for what," she said simply, "but I knew something would come." The plan was detailed, and it would take 3 days to prepare. I would be the one to enter the operations deck through the tertiary hatch, because my risk classification was lowest. I would carry a data extractor that Gareth had been building in pieces over 6 months from components he had collected from broken equipment that the council discarded without checking. It was not elegant. It was not sophisticated. It was a small, ugly device built from salvaged parts by human hands in the dark, and according to Gareth, it would work. I would copy the navigation core data. I would transmit it on a frequency that the council did not monitor because they did not know humans had learned to generate it, using a method that would take too long to explain but which Lucy would operate from a secondary position. And then we would wait for 0 hour. What happened after 0 hour, Gareth said, was up to Yusuf. I thought about the Overseer Gray as we dispersed back to our bunks. I thought about Rob and Oliver and Helen. I thought about the data chip hidden in a ration block, and the 3 words scratched onto a strip of blister wrap, and the 14 months of looking like someone who had stopped fighting. I thought about the fact that the Council had looked at humanity for 40 years and seen exactly what they expected to see. Not because we had shown it to them, but because they had never considered the possibility that we might be showing them something else. That was the night I stopped feeling afraid. Not because the danger had decreased. The danger had, if anything, increased sharply. But fear had been sitting in me for years like a stone, heavy and cold and familiar, and something had shifted it loose. Not hope, not anger. Clarity. I knew what I was doing. I knew why. And for the first time in 2 years aboard a ship that had never been mine, breathing air that was never clean, carrying a number instead of a name, I felt the sharp and specific weight of being a person with a purpose. I pulled my blanket over myself in the dark and stared at the ceiling. 3 days. Part 3. I went in on Thursday. The tertiary maintenance hatch was exactly where Petra had said it would be, behind the water reclamation unit on Deck 6, behind a panel that required a standard hex tool to open, which Gareth had sourced from the same pile of discarded equipment that had given us half the components for the extractor. The panel came off in my hands without resistance. The hatch beyond it was narrow. I had to turn sideways to fit. The crawlway beyond it was dark and warm and smelled like metal and recycled air. I moved through it on my hands and knees, counting the turns from the diagram Gareth had scratched into the floor of bunk 12 and then erased. Left, straight, right, 2 hatches, up the service ladder, the 3rd panel on the right. I was not thinking about what would happen if I was caught. I had made a decision, sometime in the 3 days between the meeting in bunk 12 and this moment, that thinking about what would happen if I was caught was not useful. It was a distraction. The thing about fear is that it costs you focus, and focus was the only resource I had right now. The service ladder was cold. I climbed it without making a sound. I had learned over 2 years on the box exactly how to move on metal surfaces, where to place your hands, where to place your feet, how to distribute your weight so nothing creaks or shifts. The council had taught us that without meaning to. Years of trying not to be noticed teaches you things. I reached the 3rd panel on the right and pressed my ear against it. Nothing. Silence and the low background hum of the ship systems. I eased the panel open and came through into the operations deck. It was cooler here. The lighting was low, a blue-tinted operational glow that the Voreth preferred during overnight system cycles. There were 4 workstations and one was active, its screen displaying a scrolling stream of data I did not need to understand. The navigation core was housed in a dedicated terminal at the far end of the room, behind a glass-paneled desk. And sitting at the active workstation with his back to me was a Voreth officer. I had not expected this. Gareth's intelligence had placed the overnight watch officer on Deck 3 during system cycle. Someone had changed the schedule. I pressed myself against the wall behind the panel I had come through and did not move. The officer did not turn around. I stood there for what felt like a very long time, measuring my breathing, keeping it slow and even. The officer was inputting data. His 4 hands moved across the controls in overlapping patterns, 2 managing the screen, 2 handling secondary input devices. He was focused. He was not watching the room. I looked at the navigation core terminal. I looked at the distance between the panel and the terminal, 12 meters approximately. The floor between us was smooth, which was bad because smooth floors carry sound. But the room's ventilation system produced a low, constant noise. Not loud, but consistent. Consistent noise, I had learned, covers movement better than silence does. I moved. I crossed the floor in a low, careful path that took twice as long as a normal walk, but produced approximately nothing in terms of sound. I reached the navigation core terminal and eased myself into the seat in front of it. The extractor was in my right boot, wrapped in cloth to stop it rattling. I got it out with 2 fingers and set it on the surface beside the terminal without making contact with the desk itself. The core interface required a code. I did not have the code. I had something Gareth had told me about, something that had taken him 4 months to figure out from a maintenance manual written in council technical language that he had pieced together word by word using the limited translation function on his collar device. The council navigation cores had a diagnostic port, a physical connection point used by engineering staff to test the system without requiring access credentials. It was not meant to provide data access. But the diagnostic port transmitted a live data signal, and a signal was a signal. I plugged the extractor into the diagnostic port. The device was ugly and it was slow, and for 43 seconds, which felt like considerably longer, it did exactly nothing. I watched the Vorath officer's back. His hands kept moving. The ventilation kept its low hum. The extractor's single indicator light blinked twice, slowly, and then held steady. I pulled it out. I wrapped it back in the cloth. I put it in my boot. I went back across the floor the way I had come, slow and low and careful. And I came through the panel and pulled it shut behind me and descended the service ladder in the dark and crawled back through the hatch and out through the water reclamation space and replaced the panel with a hex tool and walked back to the sleeping corridor and sat down on my bunk. Lucy was waiting 3 bunks down, her eyes open in the dark. I gave her a single nod. She got up and went to do her part. I sat very still and breathed. That was Thursday. 0 hour was Sunday. The council, in their 40 years of managing human labor populations, had identified that human workers were most docile in the first hours of the 7th shift day, because our bodies and minds had by then accumulated enough fatigue to suppress most of what they classified as emotional volatility. Sunday on our cycle was shift day 7. They had structured our rotation deliberately to ensure that the beginning of each new week caught us at our lowest. What they had not considered was that we knew this. We had noticed it years ago, and Yusuf, when he chose 0 hour, had chosen it precisely because the council would be reading our biometric data at the moment it began and seeing exactly what they expected to see. Maximum fatigue, minimum risk. On Sunday, at the beginning of the shift, I was standing at my station at the ore loader as always. Colin was at his crate. Petra was 3 stations down. Gareth was on loading detail. Lucy was on the upper deck. Gray was doing his morning round. At exactly the moment Yusuf had specified, which I kept in my head the way you keep something you have memorized rather than written down, I looked across the bay at Colin. He was already looking at me. We moved. What happened in the next 4 hours was not clean or organized the way it looks in stories. It was loud and fast and confusing, and required us to make decisions in seconds that we had only half planned for. The engine room fell to our cell before Gray had finished his round, because Gareth had spent 6 years learning exactly which systems could be physically disabled by a person who knew where to put their hands. And Gareth put his hands in the right places within the first 3 minutes. I went for the communications array. The communications array was on the bridge level, which required passing through 2 corridors that Gray's regular round would have covered. But Gray was not running his regular round anymore. Gray had heard the sounds from the engine room and was moving toward them. I heard his clicking as I went the other direction, fast and low, and I did not look back. The array room was unmanned. I got through the door using a method I will not detail except to say that Petra had explained it to me, patiently, twice, and it worked. I sat down at the communications array, and I began to do what Lucy had spent 3 days teaching me to do. I jammed the council distress frequencies, one by one, working through the list I had kept in my head. It was not instant. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which I could hear, distantly, the sounds of the rest of the ship changing. Sounds that told me things were happening. Some of them told me things were going wrong, because things always go wrong, and the plan had accounted for that. We were not machines. We were people doing an enormous and dangerous thing with imperfect tools and imperfect information. Somewhere in those 11 minutes, Gareth was cornered by two Voreth crew members and made a decision that I only heard about afterward from Colin, who had been close enough to see. I will say only that Gareth was not someone who made small decisions. He was someone who had spent 6 years waiting for a moment worth the cost, and when it came, he did not hesitate. I finished jamming the frequencies. Gray came through the door of the array room 40 seconds later. He stood in the doorway. His 4 hands were at different positions, 2 raised in the Voreth posture that I had learned meant threat assessment, 2 hanging lower. He looked at me sitting at the communications array with my hands on the controls, and he clicked. Once. The sound the Voreth make when they are processing something that does not fit their expectations. I looked at him. I did not move from the chair. In 2 years I had never looked directly at Gray. I had learned not to. Looking directly was classified as challenging behavior in the Council's behavioral metrics, and challenging behavior attracted consequences. I had kept my eyes down or to the side for 2 years, and it had kept me safe and invisible, and had, according to Gareth, produced the biometric profile of a person who had accepted her situation. I looked at him now. He clicked again, a different sound. I did not know its precise meaning, but I knew it was not the sound of someone still in control of the situation. I said clearly, "This ship belongs to us now." He moved. I will not describe what happened in the next few minutes except to say that Gray was larger than me, and faster, and had 4 arms to my 2, and none of that was enough. The Council had spent 40 years deciding we were not a threat. Gray had spent 2 years watching me shovel ore and reading my biometric data and confirming daily that H7441 was a functioning unit with no risk of disruption. He had never once considered what 2 years of working that loader had done to my hands and arms and back. He had never thought about what it might mean that humans keep going long after the point where most species stop. He had read our endurance as resignation. He had read our patience as defeat. He was wrong about what we were made of. When it was over, I sat back down at the communications array. My hands were unsteady for the first time since Thursday. I let them shake for a moment. Then I steadied them. Then I transmitted a single encrypted signal on the frequency that Lucy had configured to the network address that Yusuf had put in the chip. The signal was one word. Confirmed. I sat in the chair in the array room of a ship that had, for the last 20 minutes, belonged to us, and I breathed. Somewhere out there, 33 other signals were being sent. 33 other cells on 33 other worlds confirming the same thing. I pressed my back against the chair and closed my eyes for exactly 5 seconds. Then I opened them, because there was still work to do. The ship had been taken, but it needed to be held, and held ships require people paying attention. I paid attention. But in those 5 seconds in the dark behind my eyes, I thought about Rob. I thought about Oliver and Helen and every number that had replaced a name. I thought about the color of the sky above Bristol on a pale gray-blue morning. I thought about Yusuf Akafar, who I had never met, who had spent 4 years building a thing that the Council had been certain could not exist. I thought about Gareth and what he had done in those 11 minutes, and what it had cost him and what it had been worth. I opened my eyes. The stars outside the operations deck porthole were very still and very bright. I had a ship to hold. Part 4. The Council chamber on Station Meridian Prime was the most impressive room I had ever stood in, and I had spent 2 years in a cargo bay. That is not a joke. The chamber was built into the top of a structure that extended 4 kilometers above the station's primary ring, a perfect sphere of transparent material that looked out onto open space on all sides. The stars were everywhere. When you stood in the center of it, you felt like you were floating in the middle of the galaxy with nothing between you and forever. I think it was designed to make visitors feel small. Standing there with Colin on my left and Petra on my right, and a human delegation of 12 people arranged behind us, I thought about that. I thought about someone designing a room specifically to reduce the confidence of whoever entered it. I thought about how much effort that took. I thought about what it meant that, even now, even after everything, the council's first instinct was to arrange the furniture to remind us of our place. Our lead negotiator was a man named Henry Adebio. He was 57 years old from Lagos, and he had been before the collection a barrister. He had spent 40 years as a laborer, most of it on a mining platform in the outer belt, and he had emerged from it carrying himself, the way certain people carry themselves after long difficulty. Not broken, not bitter, but refined. Stripped down to something very clean and very solid. I had met Henry 3 days ago on the transport from the box to Meridian Prime. He had shaken my hand and said, "I hear you took a communications array." I had said yes. He had said, "Well done," and that was the entirety of the praise, which was appropriate because there was a great deal of other work to do. The council's 5 elder representatives were already seated when we entered. 5 species. 5 thrones, which was the only word for them, arranged in a shallow arc on a raised platform at the far end of the chamber. The Voreth were represented, which meant Grey's kind. The others were species I had seen in person only rarely. The Shan, who were tall and gray-green and moved with a liquid smoothness that seemed to suggest they had more joints than visible. The Dorathi, who were compact and dense and covered in a fine layer of something between scales and feathers. The Vel, who were barely visible, existing in the chamber as a semi-transparent shimmer that occasionally resolved into a vaguely humanoid shape. And the Arath, who were the oldest of the council species, who looked like nothing so much as very large, very still trees, except that they breathed and their eyes moved. The Arath representative was the one whose eyes I could not stop coming back to. They were amber and very calm. They had been calm for what I suspected was a very long time. The lead diplomat was Vorath. His name translated approximately as first voice, and he had been first voice of the council for 11 years. He had the particular quality of someone who has spent a long career being agreed with. When he spoke, the air in the room adjusted slightly, the way a room adjusts when someone turns up the pressure. He opened by saying, in careful translated language, that the council recognized the recent events as an expression of accumulated grievance, which was a reasonable thing, and that they were prepared to discuss adjustments to the labor arrangement framework, which showed a commitment to the well-being of all species under council guidance. He said it the way you say something you have decided on in advance, which you are presenting as a generous offer, expecting gratitude. Henry let him finish. Then Henry placed a data slate on the table in front of him. He did not say what was on it, he just placed it there, flat, face down. The first voice looked at the slate. We welcome any documentation of 40 years of records. Henry said, his voice was level and unhurried. Compiled from testimony by 11,432 surviving human workers across 63 council installations. Incident reports, equipment malfunction filings, mortality statistics, cross-referenced with the council's own internal logs, which our people accessed during the recent action. Silence. The number, Henry continued, of human deaths filed as equipment malfunction in those 40 years is 9,211. The silence got heavier. In the council's own internal logs, Henry said, the classification note on the majority of these incidents reads, organic unit failure, non-recoverable, cause unrelated to equipment. They were filed as equipment malfunction in external records to avoid triggering the council's own humanitarian review protocols. The first voice said, we will need to verify. You filed them, Henry said. Verify away. I was standing at the side of the chamber, watching. I had no official role in the negotiation. I was there because Henry had said, when we boarded the transport, that he wanted people around the table who had been on the ships, not because they would speak, but because their presence said something that words could not. I watched the first voice. I watched his four hands move slightly, which was how the Voreth expressed what I had learned to recognize as discomfort. I watched the Shan representative exchange a look with the Durathi one. I watched the Arith's amber eyes, which did not move at all. It was the Vel representative who spoke next. Its voice came from the shimmer it occupied, translated into sound by the chamber's systems as a low, measured tone. The Council acknowledges that the labor framework may have been implemented with insufficient attention to welfare metrics. Henry looked at the Vel. Insufficient, he said. The Vel's shimmer compressed slightly. We are acknowledging. 9,211 people, Henry said, died in conditions your own logs describe as preventable. The word you are looking for is not insufficient. I am not going to help you find a smaller word. I had not expected that. I do not think the council had either. There was a quality to the room in that moment that I had not felt before. I had felt fear in rooms. I had felt tension. I had felt the particular weight of being in a space where someone with power is deciding what to do with you. This was different. The council members were not deciding what to do with us. They were trying to figure out what we were going to do with them. I had grown up, all of us had grown up in the shadow of the council's certainty about us, pre-rational, emotionally unstable, developing. The words were in every official document, every public statement, every translated address to the human labor populations. They were meant to explain why we were managed rather than governed, why we were collected rather than met, why our deaths were filed as equipment malfunctions and our names were replaced with numbers. Watching the council sit across from Henry Adebio, who had spent 40 years in a mining platform, and emerged from it carrying himself like a man who had simply been waiting for the appropriate occasion, I understood something that I had intellectually known but never felt in my bones until now. They had always been afraid of us. Not because we were dangerous initially, but because we were unfamiliar. The Council's entire framework for managing other species rested on the ability to categorize and predict. The Shan behaved in Shan ways. The Durathi responded to Durathi patterns. Every species the Council had ever encountered fit somewhere in their accumulated knowledge of how living things thought and moved and reacted. We did not fit. Our emotional range was too wide. Our responses were too variable. We grieved and laughed in the same hour. We ran toward things that should make us run away. We kept going long past the point where their models said we should stop. We were, in their classification system, perpetually anomalous, and they had resolved that anomaly by deciding we were simply not rational enough to be unpredictable on purpose. And then we were. The Arith representative spoke for the first time. Its voice, translated, was deep and slow, like stones settling. It said, "You intend to leave the council framework." It was not a question. Henry said, "We left it 12 days ago." The Arith was quiet for a long moment. Then it said, "What do you want?" Henry picked up the data slate from the table. He turned it over and placed it face up. On its surface was not a document. It was a list of names. I could see from where I was standing that the list was long, many pages, small text. "We want these people remembered," Henry said, "by name, in the Council's official records, every one of them." The first voice said, "We can discuss a memorial framework." "We are not discussing a framework," Henry said. "We are telling you what we want. You will record every name. You will correct every equipment malfunction filing. You will acknowledge in your official record what happened and who was responsible. And then we will talk about what comes next, in that order." Another silence. I looked at the Voreth first voice. I was looking directly at him, which I was still not fully used to doing. He was looking at Henry with an expression I had no council word for. I had a human word for it. Reckoning. Then something happened that I had not expected, and that, from the reactions of the people around me, no one else had expected either. The Dorathi representative activated a device on its seat, a small projector that cast a faint field around its immediate space. Gareth had told me about this field. It was called a resonance field, and the Dorathi used it in high-stakes negotiations. It generated a low, subsonic vibration calibrated to produce a sense of unease in most known species. A physiological response. The Dorathi had used it for centuries in negotiations with other council members when they wanted the other side to concede quickly. I felt nothing. I glanced at Colin. He glanced back at me. Neither of us had felt anything. I looked at Petra. She had noticed the field activate and was examining it with mild interest, the way she examined most things as an engineering problem. Henry had not moved. The Dorathi representative deactivated the field after approximately 30 seconds. It looked at Henry. It looked at me. It looked at our entire delegation. It said very quietly, "Fascinating." And then something else happened that I would spend a long time thinking about later. The Vel representative, the shimmer that had compressed itself into a vaguely humanoid shape, rippled. It turned to the Voreth first voice and said something in council tongue, too fast for my translation collar to catch. But the first voice responded in kind, and the exchange went on for several seconds, and I watched both of them. And I watched the Arith's amber eyes move slowly between our delegation and the two of them having that exchange. Henry, who had a better translation collar than I did, provided me with a summary afterward. The Vel had said, "We have made a significant classification error." The first voice had said, "They were assessed at the time of collection." The Vel had said, "Yes, but assessment assumes the subject is static. What if they were not static? What if they were changing?" The first voice had not had an answer. Henry placed one more item on the table before we left. It was a second data slate. This one contained a proposal, not a request. A proposal, phrased the way one party phrases something to another party of equal standing. Reparations, timeline, terms, the return of sovereignty over Earth and over the labor populations on every council installation where humans still worked, an independent monitoring arrangement, a formal reclassification of humanity in the council's species database, removing the pre-rational designation and replacing it with nothing, because we did not need their label. The first voice looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "You are walking out." Henry said, "We walked out 12 days ago. We are leaving the room now." We left the room. In the corridor outside the chamber, one of the council's administrative staff, a young Voreth who could not have been much older than me in their aging, stepped beside me as we walked and said quietly, in careful translated language, "I need to ask you something. Not for the record." I stopped. The rest of the delegation moved ahead. Colin glanced back. I nodded at him. The young Voreth said, "What are you? We have cataloged 10,000 species. Nothing in the catalog matches what we have seen in the last 12 days. I am not asking for the council. I am asking for myself. I need to understand." I looked at him for a moment. I said 40 years ago when your ships came to our world we lost everything. Our freedom, our choices, our names, people we loved. We spent 40 years being told we were not rational enough to be real, not developed enough to matter, not worth remembering by name. I paused. And we spent 40 years getting up every morning and keeping going anyway, not because we had given up, because we had not. The young Voreth was very still. "That is what we are," I said. "We are the ones who have not given up. We have never given up. You just did not know what that looked like from the outside." I walked away to catch up with the delegation. Behind me, I heard him standing very still for a long time before he moved. Part 5. A year. It is a strange thing to arrive back somewhere you have spent years missing so intensely that you stopped letting yourself miss it, because missing it was a form of pain you could not afford, and then to be standing in it, On it, I suppose, because Earth is the kind of place you stand on rather than in. The ground is under you. The sky is above you. The air moves. The air moves. I had forgotten that. The way air moves on a planet, not the mechanical circulation of a ship's recycler, not the dead stillness of a pressurized corridor, but actual air, pushed by actual wind, carrying with it the smell of soil and distance and weather. I stood on a hillside outside Bristol on a morning that was overcast and gray-green and cool, and I breathed, and I did not think of anything for a full minute because the breathing was enough. Then the minute passed, and I thought of plenty. A year had not been long enough to process everything that had happened. I was not sure how long would be long enough. I was not sure time was the right unit of measurement for it. The 12 days of the action, as people were calling it now, had compressed more experience into a shorter period than my previous 8 years combined. And the year after had been its own kind of compression. Negotiations, arrangements, the slow unwinding of a 40-year system that had woven itself into everything. The council had agreed to the reparations terms. They had not agreed quickly or gracefully. It had taken 4 months of back and forth between Henry's team and the council's representatives, during which the council had tried 17 different approaches to reducing the scope of their obligations, and Henry had refused each one with a patience and precision that I had observed, on 2 occasions, from the room next door, through a wall that was thinner than I think the council knew. Henry was extraordinary. He was the kind of person who made you understand that extraordinary was not about talent or intelligence alone. It was about what you chose to spend yourself on. The names were recorded, all of them, 9,211 names in the council's official archive. It had taken a team of 40 people 2 months to compile and verify them all. Rob's name was in there. Oliver's name. Helen's name. Every number that had replaced a name now had its name back. I had sat in a room and read through the list the day it was finalized. I had not expected it to be as hard as it was. Knowing the list existed and sitting with the list in front of you were 2 different things. I read it from beginning to end. It took 4 hours. I did not skip anyone. A pre-rational designation had been removed from the council's species database. In its place was a notation that read, "Species status under revision, pending reclassification in accordance with observed behavioral and social capacity assessments." It was bureaucratic language, which was the council's way of doing things, but what it meant, practically, was that they no longer had a formal basis for treating us the way they had. Whether formal basis and actual practice were the same thing remained to be seen. That was the work of the next years and the years after those, and I did not have illusions about how clean or simple it would be. What I had instead was the hillside outside Bristol on a gray-green morning, and the air moving, and a man named Yusuf Akafur sitting on a rock 3 meters away from me, drinking from a flask and looking at the valley below. We had met properly for the first time 6 weeks after the action. He was exactly nothing like I had imagined. I had imagined someone forceful and magnetic, a natural leader in the visible way, the kind of person around whom rooms organize themselves. Yusuf was quiet. He was 41, with an unhurried way of moving and a habit of listening that was different from most people's listening. Most people listen while thinking about what they are going to say. Yusuf listened, as if what you were saying was the only thing in the room. He had said the first time we met, "Gareth told me about you, 2 years before the action." I had said, "Gareth has been gone 4 months." Yusuf had said, "Yes," and he would have been extremely annoyed if we wasted time being sad about it when there is still work to do. Which was, as it happened, exactly the thing Gareth would have said. I looked across the hillside at Yusuf now and said, "What are you thinking about?" He said the Shan. I turned, "Why?" "They sent a message last week," he said. "Through unofficial channels, they want to talk, not through the council, directly." This was the 3rd such approach in the past 2 months. The first had been from a species called the Tenori, a mid-tier council member who had observed the 12 days of the action from what they had hoped was a safe distance, and then, apparently, done a great deal of thinking. The second had been from an independent station system in the outer sectors that was not a council member, but had been operating under council trade agreements that were, in practice, indistinguishable from subordination. The Shan were different. The Shan were one of the 5 elder species, one of the 5 who had been in that chamber, who had exchanged looks when Henry put the data slate on the table. "What do they want to talk about?" I said. "They did not say," Yusuf said. "They said they wanted to understand us better, that they had been wrong in their assessment and they wanted to correct it." He paused. "They used a phrase that is interesting in their language. It translates approximately as, 'We were looking but not seeing.'" I thought about that. "Do you trust them?" I said. "Not yet," he said, "but I am interested in the conversation." That was Yusuf, interested in the conversation. He had built a 4-year network across 34 worlds by being interested in conversations, by understanding that the people doing the hardest work in the worst conditions were paying attention to everything around them, filing it away, because when you have nothing else, you pay attention. He had taken that attention and given it direction. He had never pretended it was simple or that the cost was low. Gareth was one of 26 people from our network who had not come through the 12 days. Yusuf knew every name. I had seen the list he carried, on a small folded piece of material that he had been adding to for 4 years. The paper was worn soft from handling. Lucy had come through. She was in Edinburgh now, working with a reconstruction team that was rebuilding civic infrastructure across northern Britain. The council's collection system had disrupted not just individual lives but entire regional economies. The rebuilding was going to take a generation, and Lucy, who had spent 4 years learning to be invisible on a council freighter, had apparently decided to spend the next 4 being very visible in a city that needed people who were good at problems. Petra was in Warsaw. She had gone back to engineering, structural specifically, which made sense for a person whose first instinct on finding a secret maintenance hatch was to memorize it in case it became useful. She sent letters. They were detailed and precise like Petra, and they always ended with a brief, dry observation about whatever the council's latest diplomatic statement had been. It was the closest Petra came to humor, and I appreciated it every time. Colin had gone home to Glasgow. He had a daughter there, 12 years old, who had been 3 when he was taken, and who he had spent 2 years showing photographs of on the rare occasions when we were allowed access to personal communications. I had met her once briefly, when she had come to see Henry's team during the reparations negotiations, which Colin had attended as a witness. She was 12 and serious, and had her father's way of observing things without seeming to. She was going to be formidable. I thought about all of them as I stood on the hillside and let the wind move across me. I thought about the year that had passed and the years that were coming. The council had signed the accords, but the council was not the galaxy. The galaxy was enormous and complicated and full of species that the council had managed for centuries and species that had existed entirely outside the council's reach and everything in between. Humanity was not going to be left alone to rebuild in peace. That was not how things worked at this scale, and I did not expect it to. What I expected was that things would be hard in different ways than they had been hard before, that the work would be different but it would still be work, that there would be moments like the one in the council chamber, where the Durathi turned on its resonance field and nothing happened, and we would have to figure out what to do with those moments. I expected that some species would come to us with genuine interest, and some with fear, and some with both at once. I expected that the Council's reclassification of humanity would move slowly through layers of institutional resistance and political negotiation, the way anything moves through institutions. I expected that there would be days when the weight of what had happened settled back onto me in the way that it did sometimes, without warning, in the middle of an ordinary moment. The first time it had happened, 3 weeks after the action, I had been sitting in a transit facility waiting for a connection, and I had looked up and seen an empty chair across from me and thought about Rob, and the weight had come down all at once, the weight of all of it, the 2 years on the box and the 40 years before them and the 9,211 names, and the ration block with the chip inside, and the 3 words scratched onto a blister wrap. I had sat very still and let it settle, and then, when it had settled, I had picked it up and carried it with me the way you carry things that are too important to put down. I was still carrying it. I thought I probably always would. That did not seem like a problem. It seemed like what it meant to have been through something. Yusuf stood up from his rock. He capped the flask. He looked out at the valley for a moment and then looked at me. "Are you glad you came back?" he said. I thought about the question. I thought about Bristol and the color of the sky and the 8 years away and the year back and everything in between. "Yes," I said, "it is different than I remembered." "Good different or hard different?" "Both," I said, "at the same time, which is apparently how things tend to be." He smiled. It was a small, genuine smile, the kind that reached his eyes. "I will tell the Shan we are open to a conversation," he said. "Not a negotiation, not an arrangement, a conversation." "What is the difference?" I said. "A negotiation," he said, "is when both sides already know what they want. A conversation is when at least one side is willing to find out." He put the flask in his coat. "The Shan said they want to understand us better. I believe them. I think they have spent a year watching humanity and realizing they have no model for what they are looking at." "That seems to be a theme," I said. "Yes," he said. "We have spent 40 years being studied by a civilization that was certain it understood what we were, and they never did because they were looking for what they expected to find." He paused. "The Shan, I think, are now trying to look differently. That is worth having a conversation about." We walked back down the hillside together. The grass was wet from overnight rain. The clouds were low and moving. Below us, Bristol spread out in its familiar way, older than I remembered it and also exactly the same in the ways that mattered. I had been born here. I had spent the first years of my life learning the streets and the sound of the river and the particular quality of the light on gray mornings. The collection had taken me from it when I was 23. The 12 days had brought me back, and standing in it now, breathing air that moved and carrying everything I was carrying, I thought about what the young Voreth administrator had asked me in the corridor outside the council chamber. "What are you?" I had given him an answer. I still thought it was a true answer, but it was not the whole answer. No single answer could be. What we were was a species that had been told for 40 years that we did not measure up, that our emotions were liabilities, our variability a weakness, our persistence a malfunction, our hope a delusion. We had been cataloged and numbered and filed and managed and told in 100 different translated languages that we were not enough. And we had kept going anyway. Not because we were fearless. Fear was with me every day of those 2 years, a constant low presence that I had learned to function alongside the way you learn to function alongside anything that will not leave. Not because we were certain of success. Gareth had not been certain. Lucy had not been. I had not been. We had moved anyway in the absence of certainty, which is the only way that anything worth doing ever actually gets done. Not because we were special in the way that stories sometimes suggest, as if surviving hard things confers some particular grace that sets you apart from others. We were not apart from others. We were people, ordinary and complicated, with bad days and fears and the persistent human habit of hopping for things we could not see yet. That was it, I thought. That was the part the council had never understood, and the part the young Voreth had not been able to find in his catalog. We hope for things we cannot see yet, and we keep going until we can see them. We went all the way down the hillside and into the city. The streets were quiet in the early morning. There was a bakery on a corner that I had not thought about in 8 years, and then had thought about with unexpected intensity in the middle of a cargo bay on a ship called the Box, and it was still there, and its door was open, and something inside it smelled like bread. We stopped. Yusuf looked at me. I said, "We are going in." He said, "Yes, obviously." We went in. Later, on a bench outside with something warm in my hands, I watched a council diplomatic shuttle arc silently across the upper sky, leaving the atmosphere. It was smaller than it used to look. Or perhaps I was seeing it from a different angle than before. Either way, it grew smaller and smaller until it was just a point of light among other points of light, and then it was gone. Yusuf said, without looking up, "They are going to come back." "I know," I said. "And the Shan, and the Tenori, and the outer station systems, and eventually others we have not heard from yet." "I know," I said again. "Are you ready for that?" I thought about everything I had been and everything that had happened and everything that was still ahead. All of it tangled together the way life tends to be tangled. Not clean or linear, but real. I said we were never the ones who were not ready. We were just the ones they had not finished underestimating. Yusuf looked at the sky where the shuttle had been. Then he looked at me. Then he looked back at his bread, which was a practical decision because it was very good bread. "Let them come," I said. And I meant it. Not as a threat. Not as defiance. Simply as a statement of fact from someone who had spent 2 years in a cargo bay counting the hours, carrying a number instead of a name, learning what it meant to keep going when everything said stop. Let them come. We would be here. We had always been here. We were not going anywhere.